Hello everyone, welcome back, History with Hilbert here, and today I'm going to be doing a video on how Henry VII killed the Wars of the Roses. Now the Wars of the Roses were a series of dynastic conflicts in England from the mid 1460s to around 1485. Now some people will put the end date for the Wars of the Roses as being a bit earlier than 1485. Other people would argue that it went on to 1487 to the Battle of Stoke, but I think most people are agreed on that 1485 is a good date to set as the end of the Wars of the Roses. Now, the Wars of the Roses was, as I said, a series of dynastic conflicts in England as well as in other parts of Europe, but mostly fought in England between the noble houses of York and Lancaster for control of the English throne. Now, in 1485, we have a Yorkist king on the English throne, King Richard III. However, a Lancastrian, Henry, lands in Wales, and the two sides meet in battle at Bosworth Field, which is a very famous name in English history. And it was fought on the 22nd of August on 1485. However, the night before the battle, Henry actually calls himself King of England. And this is a very clever thing, because by doing it the day before the battle, anyone fighting against Henry, so on the side of Richard, who, remember, was still King of England during the battle, only after did Henry really become King of England. But by saying he was king the day before the battle, then anyone who fights against him in the battle is technically a traitor fighting against the King of England, so he can then do what he wants with the captives after the battle. And indeed, Henry does win with thanks to William Stanley and the timely intervention. Now, his immediate actions after Bosworth and becoming king are really important, and they're very clever as well. So, first of all, he obviously has to deal with the fallout from Bosworth. So, obviously, there are lots of dead, lots of people have been killed, lots of important nobles have been killed, but as well, the people who are still alive who have been captured. So, you have all the people who have come in from the other side, who he has taken prisoner, who he needs to deal with. And there are some quite important high-ranking figures here. Now, probably the most high-ranking, most important one, Richard III, is killed, so he doesn't have to worry about the king anymore. However, the Earl of Warwick, who at that time was only 10 years old, was the nephew of Richard III, being the son of Richard's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and he obviously has a very strong claim to the throne, so Henry sends him to the Tower of London. Now, what's important to remember is that during Henry VII's reign, the Tower of London wasn't this, this drab, dank, torture chamber, prison-style thing that we like to think of as being today, but it was rather a royal residence. But then it was also the royal residence in the heart of London, so that the king could keep an eye on the people he didn't quite trust. As well as this, he calls Parliament after his coronation, and this is important because it shows the people of England that he doesn't need Parliament to be crowned king. He's done this himself. He wants, the glory. He wants to show that he's powerful enough. He doesn't need Parliament to say, okay, Henry, you can be king. He does this after the coronation to say, I'm king, and now I'm going to call up Parliament. As well as this, he marries Elizabeth of York, who is the daughter of Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV, who was king before Richard III. And essentially this really ends the Wars of the Roses, in my opinion, because it's the coming together of the two houses, of Henry, the Lancastrian, and of Elizabeth of York. Now, Henry's claim is a lot weaker than a lot of other people, and that's something that was a big issue for him during the start of his reign, because he only really has a claim to the throne through his mother's side, and then it's because the King of England was married to the lover of his great-grandfather. It's a very long stretch for Henry, but by marrying Elizabeth of York, who is the daughter of a King of England, then his claim becomes so much more palatable, so much more reasonable. And as well, by marrying a Yorkist, he is bringing on side lots and lots of Yorkists who otherwise would have been opposed to him as a Lancastrian. And very important for medieval monarch, he produces an heir, and then another one, and another. So in 1485, his first child is born, who is called Prince Arthur, and then in 1489, Prince Henry is born, who will later go on to be King Henry VIII, and then as well is born later on Edmund. And as I was saying before, he also crowns Elizabeth of York as Queen of England to show that the Yorkists and the Lancastrians are now working together rather than being opposed to each other. And this hopefully will bring more Yorkists to his side, over to his banner. Now, it wasn't plain sailing for Henry VII, and there were a lot of challenges to his throne to try and usurp him, as he had done Richard. Now, the first one of any significant noting is the Lord Lovell's Rising, which happened in Easter of 1486. And Lord Lovell was a prominent noble. He was a supporter of Richard III, and he attempted to instigate a rebellion in Worcestershire in 1486. But thanks to Henry's spy system, which I'm going to get on later, the plot was intercepted, Henry knew about it, and he was apprehended, and he, as well as some others who were involved, either fled or were captured. Now, a much more serious attempt to dethrone Henry came in June of 1487, when Lambert Simnel, who pretended to be the Earl of Warwick. Now, of course, today it seems stupid, you know, if I said, oh, I'm Queen Elizabeth of Great Britain, everyone would laugh at me and they say, no, you're not. But back then, before there were photos, before there were ID and fingerprints, you could do that. You could, if you had a good enough resemblance, and even still, most people would never have seen the monarch of a country, so they wouldn't really know what they looked like per se. So if you had even a slight passing resemblance, you could pass yourself off as someone. And people did this, especially in this era. There are two very significant pretenders, they're called, in this era, who try and pass themselves off as these Yorkists, and they garner support from other Yorkist factions in England at the time. And one of these is Lambert Simnel, and he actually lands with a force of Irish and Flemish troops in Lancashire, and he's supported by John de la Pole, who is also a Yorkist nobleman, but they are defeated at the Battle of Stoke Field by the Royal Army, where John de la Pole is killed, and Lambert Simnel is then captured. And then he's put to work in the palace kitchens by Henry VII, who is obviously feeling very generous instead of executing him. Now, this is another one of the pretenders that I was mentioning. In July 1495, Perkin Warbeck landed in Kent, but before he even got off the boat, his army had been surrounded and destroyed by the royal troops, which again goes to show how prepared Henry was for these incursions, how well informed he was. And Perkin Warbeck pretended to be Richard, son of Edward IV, who was king before Richard III. And if you've heard of the famous story of the princes in the Tower, the two princes who were locked away in the Tower of London, and then they were apparently smothered to death on the command of Richard III, it's a very hot topic between some people. But he actually claimed to be one of these princes, the youngest son of Edward IV, one of the princes in the Tower. But again, he was in reality, he was a Flemish merchant and not one of the princes in the Tower. We are pretty certain. But he wasn't done trying, and in September 1497, he actually landed in Cornwall. But when the royal army approached, he actually fled his own army, but was captured afterwards, and in a move that is very typical of Henry VII. He combines punishment with a chance to balance his books and get a load of cash in. So what he actually does is, instead of, hanging this whole Cornish rebel army, what he does is he actually finds them all. He kills the ringleaders to stop them, inciting another rebellion. But he finds this enormous 6,000 strong, apparently, Cornish army. And it's very typical of Henry because he does this a lot. He uses financing, and he was a very clever cashier and financier. And he often combined punishment with money, so that he punished people by taking their money, and that obviously made him richer and put him into a stronger position as well. Now, as I said, Henry had a spy network which was very successful, and in the case of Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel as well, he knew about the invasions before they were going to take place, so he could prepare for them. And the whole point of these invasions often was to incite a rebellion. Now, Lambert Simnel did arrive with some troops, as did Perkin Warbeck, but nothing near large enough to take on the army. The idea was to land somewhere, as Perkin Warbeck did in Cornwall, where there had been a rebellion just a few months before he landed, to incite unrest and then to hopefully get the population to rise up and rebel against Henry, and then that to spread across the country until there was a wholesale rebellion against the establishment and against Henry's authority. But this doesn't really happen, which is part of the reason why these attempts fail. Now, Henry set up a spy network across the country through the different bands of society, so even in lower down societies, so that he knew which areas were most loyal and which weren't, so that he knew if Perkin Warbeck's going to try and land in Lancashire, well, how do Lancastrians feel? Are they going to support me, or are they likely to rise up? And if so, what measures do I need to take? And as is often with Henry VII, which is very different to previous kings, he promotes not just the nobility, which had been done by every other monarch up until that point, but he promotes the classes lower down in society as well, which makes him less popular with the nobility. For example, the lawyers, they become very prominent in this era. The lawyers such as Fox and Dudley and Empson are very famous names from this time. And these people, as well as members of the clergy, they start to rise up in society and start to make a name for himself that would have been impossible with the predecessors of Henry VII. Now, the carrot and stick is often used to describe Henry's different policies towards different individuals during his reign. And if, in case you don't know, the carrot is meant to symbolize gifts, it's rewards. If you think of a pig, you give the pig the carrot, well, it's a reward. The pig gets to eat something, it's nice. If you hold a carrot out in front of a pig, it'll follow the carrot. And that's because the pig wants to get a reward. And it's similar with Henry as well. So, for example, what he can do is he wants the Earl of Stafford. He wants him to be a good boy and not to rise up against him to usurp the throne. So what he does is he said, well, Earl of Stafford, you know what? I'm going to give Warwickshire to you. It's a nice estate there. You can, get a lot of land. Then you'll be nice to me. And he'll feel indebted to Henry. He'll say, oh, thank you very much. I really like this land. I'm going to be a nice kid. However, he also has the stick, and the stick is pretty much the opposite. The stick is saying, well, Earl of Stafford, you're going to be nice, otherwise I'm going to take Staffordshire away from you and you'll be left with nothing. And there was an act which kings in this era often did, well, not often, but they could do, called an Act of Attainder, where they stripped a noble of all their titles, of all their possessions, of all their land, and exiled them. So that was the stick. That was, making sure people didn't misbehave. And Henry was good at doing them both. Now, Henry had a new system of financial punishment, which I covered a bit earlier, especially with a system called the bonds and recognizances, which are basically that people would promise to do a certain thing or not to do a certain thing. So one of the rules which he passed was the amount of retainers, which are the armed knights or soldiers a noble could keep, which was one of the reasons the Wars of the Roses went on for so long, because of all these private armies. And these bonds and recognizances were basically Henry would give a large sum of money as a gift to a noble, and it would be a very large sum of money. And of course, you're not going to say no, and you can't say no because he's the King of England, so you accept the gift. But lo and behold, if you then break your promise to the king, then he will swoop down on you and he will say, right, well, I want it all back and 10 times as much, and in a month. And this sort of financial burden, no one could pay this. It was literally huge amounts. So if you broke your bond and recognizance, you were in the shit. You really were in a bad place. And he does this very cleverly. So he uses both the carrot and the stick. For example, after Bosworth, he gave rewards to certain people. So his uncle Jasper Tudor, he gave a lot of land to and pretty much most of Wales to look after. But people like Northumberland, who he was on Richard's side, but he didn't actually fight at Bosworth. He first puts him in prison, but then at the end of the year, he already releases him and gives him control of the north. And turns out to be a very good move, because Northumberland turns out to be a capable lord and doesn't rebel against him. So you see how he uses both in contrast. And there are also others who he just gives the stick, like the Earl of Warwick, who is locked up for years and years until he is executed at the grand age of 24. Something else that Henry does is that he learns from others' mistakes, and this is one of the reasons why the Wars of the Roses didn't continue and why Henry VII wasn't overthrown by one of these Yorkist pretenders or usurpers who I mentioned previously. And I'm going to show some of them to you now. Now, on the left here is Henry VI, who isn't the father of Henry VII, by the way. It's a common mistake. They are related distantly, but he was the king who was king at the time when the Wars of the Roses started, and Henry VII is the king, obviously, when the Wars of the Roses ended. So I'm going to show you what they did differently and why Henry VII was ultimately way better. Now, were they involved in expensive foreign wars? Henry VI absolutely was. The 100 Years' War, and he lost the 100 Years' War pretty spectacularly badly. Now, this is quite unfair, because Henry VI was an infant while the war was still going on, and the Duke of Bedford was in charge. But Bedford did an absolutely magnificent job of running France for the infant Henry VI. But Henry VII was very clever in his foreign policy, and he doesn't get bogged down in any large foreign wars. That doesn't mean he doesn't do any fighting. He does, especially in the Breton crisis of 1492. But he does this very cleverly. Now, the King of France at the time was focusing on Italy, where he was fighting a campaign. And Henry VII, to stop French power from growing by attacking Brittany, which is a region in the northwest of France, he invaded France with a fairly substantially sized army of 26,000 men. But there's not really any real fighting. He does lay siege to a city called Boulogne, but he is then he sits down with the French, and he gets this treaty of Etaples, which is really favourable for the English. They're paid something like £159,000, which is ridiculous, and the French promise to exile all Yorkist pretenders and claimants to the English throne in France, which is a brilliant deal. And Henry's very clever, I think, in his foreign policy, unlike Henry VI. Now, could he control the nobility? Henry VI absolutely could not. He was controlled by the nobility, especially by different factions at his court, by his wife, Margaret of Anjou, and also by his uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And there was a lot of factional infighting at court, which is one of the reasons why the Wars of the Roses actually erupted in the first place. Henry VII, totally different story. Henry was the bane of the English nobility, and it's an often argued point as to what the precise nature of the relationship between Henry and his nobility was. And he often gets a lot of stick for his relationship with the nobility, saying, oh, the nobility hated him and this and that. But I think that's exactly what England needed. England needed a king who wasn't afraid to kick the nobility up the arse and tell them, right, I'm not taking this anymore, I'm in charge. Because Henry VI couldn't do this at all, which is why the Wars of the Roses started in the first place, because the nobility got too big for their boots. They owned these private armies, and this meant that they could try and take on the throne and try and take politics into their own hands. Now, Henry VII was clearly in charge, and he makes clear that he is in charge many times throughout his reign. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the bonds and recognizances keeps them in check. You know, nobody wants to step out of line. Nobody wants to try and usurp the throne, because then you'll get this massive financial penalty on your head. Now, oversight of finances. Henry VI, again, does very badly in this sense, whereas Henry VII was a very astute financier, as I already said. The economy grows very largely, and he also forms these organizations, the Council Learned in Law, which is they pretty much were the biggest scumbaggy lawyers you could ever think of, but he started off his reign in considerable debt, and he'd balanced the books very quickly and then made a lot of money very quickly as well, which left income to his successor. And he was very clever in his financial policies as well, unlike Henry VI, who just lost money and spent it on things that were completely useless, as well as the war in France, which he then went on to lose, which angered people, which helped the Yorkist cause in the Wars of the Roses. Now, were they able to take military action? Henry VI, again, he wasn't a decisive man. He let others control him, and in the medieval era, it was absolutely essential that a king was seen at the head of an army, capable militarily. And Henry VII, he was only king because he fought at Bosworth, and he actually came within striking distance of Richard III, which just shows that he was very committed to the battle and committed to fighting and appearing as a military leader. Now, the growing economy, again, Henry VII does a lot of wonders, in my opinion. You know, I'm quite a big fan of this guy, if you couldn't tell by now. But he promotes the mercantile class. He promotes merchants, and he works in their interest. I think there was a company called the Mercer Company, which was founded to protect the interests of English merchants, as well as actually using politics to protect them. So, for example, he embargoes the Burgundian Netherlands at this time. Although this wasn't a very clever move, we can see now he was doing it in the interest of the English merchants. Now, produced an heir who inherited the throne. Henry VI did produce an heir. I believe Edmund? Yes, I believe he was called Edmund, but he was actually killed at either Tewkesbury or Taunton. I forget which one, I always get them mixed up. But Henry VII does, again, he outplays him in this ballpark. He produces 3 sons, 2 of which died fairly early. Arthur, tragically, a month after he was married, and also Edmund died as well. But Henry VIII didn't die, and obviously we all know Henry VIII now, and that was a success. And even sanity. Henry VI wasn't sane as we would say now. He had bursts of insanity, bursts of not knowing what to do and being completely helpless. And obviously this isn't what you want in someone who is all-powerful in your country, or meant to be. Whereas, you know, Henry VII was steadfast all the way through. He did have his ups and downs, obviously, as everyone does, but he did just control his mind and did control the country as a king ought to have done. Now we're going to have a look at the Yorkists before and after Henry comes to power, and how he really shuts down the Wars of the Roses from happening. Now, first of all, we have Edward, Earl of Warwick, who, as I said, was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, who was the brother of Edward IV and Richard III, who both were kings of England at different times. And obviously, being the nephew of 2 kings gives him an incredibly strong claim to the throne, much stronger than Henry's own claim to the throne, which, as I said earlier, was, you know, through a via. Now, what he does with the Earl of Warwick, as I said earlier as well, is he imprisons him straight away after Bosworth and puts him in the Tower. And he is actually executed in 1499 for apparently trying to escape the Tower with Perkin Warbeck. Whether this is true or fabricated, just so that, you know, Henry can have him executed, just so that he's out of the way, we don't know. But he was executed for this in 1499, and this gets rid of another key element of Yorkist resistance to the Lancastrian Henry's own supremacy of the crown. Now, next we have John de la Pole, and John de la Pole was the Earl of Lincoln and the Duke of Suffolk as well, and he was killed at the Battle of Stoke Field trying to assert Lambert Simnel's claim to the throne. And next we have his son, Edmund de la Pole, and he was actually handed over after the Castilian affair, which basically, to explain this, was that John de la Pole fled England in, I believe, 1503, and he went to the Burgundian Netherlands to seek shelter there. But the twist of fate would have it the Isabella of Spain died in I believe 1504, and this meant that Philip of Burgundy, who was married to Isabella's daughter, had to go to Spain to collect the inheritance, which was Spain, and he then later, I believe, became Philip of Spain. But on the way to Spain from Belgium, he was shipwrecked in England, and Henry VII, he used this opportunity. He then basically forced them, saying, you need to hand over John de la Pole or we're not going to let you go. So then Philip was forced to hand over, Edmund de la Pole, was forced to hand over Edmund de la Pole to Henry VII. And Henry VII, when Edmund is in his possession, he sends him to prison again, and he is actually killed by Henry VIII, who, I think in his own words, couldn't see the point of having him anymore, which is quite typical Henry VIII as well. And finally, we have Richard de la Pole, who was a brother of Edmund de la Pole. And he is seen as the last white rose, the last real Yorkist claimant. Because as you can see, the Yorkists everywhere have been, the tree has been cut, has been stumped. And Richard de la Pole lives in exile for most of his life, and then he's killed in Italy. I believe it was in the battle or the siege of Pavia that he was fighting for the French and that he was killed there. Oh, this has been my video about Henry VII and how he ended the Wars of the Roses. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you have, and you know someone who you think would find this interesting or useful as well, please do share it with them. Let them know about it, help the channel to grow, and leave a thumbs up, leave a comment. If you know any more information about this or want to discuss anything, just leave a comment and I should get back to you when I have some time on my hands. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. This has been History with Hilbert, as always. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you soon with more history.